CEU Medieval Radio, Past Perfect, the talk show about medieval and early modern culture.
Hello and welcome to Past Perfect, CEU Medieval Radio's podcast on all things late antique, medieval and early modern. My name is Milekovic, and together with Professor Volker Menze,
hello,
I'm joined by a guest who needs no introduction, Peter Brown. The occasion, however, are the newly published memoirs, written by Professor Brown, titled Journeys of the Mind, and published by Princeton University Press in 2023. Professor Brown, it's an immense honor.
Yes, welcome everybody also from my side. I'm also very honored to see Peter again after many years. And we were both thrilled to read your beautiful book. As you can see, I've made myself many notes on this long autobiography, although I think the last 35 years missing, right? It's from the early years until 1987, the death of your mother, and you being a permanent in Princeton, and 35 years in Princeton is only a very short epilogue. And it was really fascinating, really like an adventure story to read. And we do have a few questions. And I think the first is a very obvious one. For the historian, how shall we write history? How shall we do this? It's a topic that comes out throughout your autobiography. Several times, I think, say, I write this for my aunts, and you introduce also the reader to your aunts, who your aunts. And I also remember, I have to say this on a very personal note, I became your student because of your writing, because, I didn't know you, I had not met you, but I met you through your writings. My very first book, I picked it up from the boxes we just opened. In German, Die letzten Heiden, The Last Pagans, which the English is, I think, The Making of Late Antiquity, your lectures in Harvard in 1978. I bought the book, I have the note in there, in May 1995, and I always said since then, I was a fan of your writing, and also bought your other books, and then at some point also applied to Princeton. And I think if, continuing this, how to write history comes up throughout your book. You start this also with your book on Augustine, that this was for Faber and Faber, not, for example, for Oxford University Press. So you said this is also, for a different audience. At another point, I don't have the exact quote now, but I think you say you try to have the rhythm of the speech also. That would be something you like to contain for you. So what is it? At the same time, I have to say, reading your books, as I say, I was a fan. It's not introductory. It's really, the scholar should read this. But at the same time, it's not dry scholarly. So can you say a little bit about, how to write history?
Oh dear, this puts me in, I'm afraid, what one might call sage mode. I must admit that I'm not yet Appa Knowledge. I'm not a great Appa. On the other hand, I think that one of the clues, which I always use when I think about it myself as to what I'm doing, is the original meaning of historia to Herodotus, which is that it is the tale of a journey to a foreign place. And I think one of my very first, not first chronologically, but my very deepest sense has always been that a historian is a traveler to what in the case of late antiquity is a very distant past. He does the historia of the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, much as Herodotus claimed to write the historia of the Median Empire and of the grand events in Anatolia of his time. So I think what one has to begin with is a sense of the past as a country. And as a country, one is under an obligation to understand in the first place and to then communicate. Hence, at the end of the story, I think communication is the more important aim, but it's in a hierarchy of aims, which one shouldn't ignore the other aims. But to tell the story right about a foreign place, whether this is visiting Putin's Russia nowadays and picking up what you can to form a judgment on an active and ambiguous player in our own world, we have the same duty to do the same to far more distant events. And a traveller who comes back with merely what the local governments have told him or her to see and to think is not a very successful traveller. And I think the historian has to be the truly enterprising traveller who will seize what counts in the past and then makes it clear. Because if one comes back and simply turns what one has seen into jargon for the sake of scoring points, maybe in one's academic profession, that is not helpful.
But in order to do this, I mean, you need to, coming to one note in your, one chapter in your book, also one of your teachers, I'm not sure if I name him correctly, Lawrence McKay.
Yes.
And his book after Kipling, the way you describe it, I was intrigued also to read it. And it was kind of, these 100 years and what is now. And if I remember correctly from, how you talked students, it was also, you need to have a certain open mind, very imaginative mind. You asked I think it was not me, one of my college students coming to class if he had been a good Donatist last week. And you are famous, I don't know if this anecdote is correct, but when I was a student in Princeton, there was an anecdote that you once asked a question in exam, what did Constantine have for breakfast? Now, these are questions, would not be the obvious one you would ask to think about. Constantine would be Christianity, would be paganism, but of course these are questions, that play a role. I mean, to be imaginative, how an emperor lived, or how a certain religious group behaves on a daily basis. These are usually not the questions that you find in the sources. If I think from my field, ecclesiastical history, you would find the controversies. There's a dogma developing. It's not really about the people. So you need to be very imaginative. And is this also where you have been influenced by Lawrence McKesnell? And related to this, I found also fascinating what you wrote in your book about a historian needs to travel. I mean, really needs to see this. And you have changed, I think, also with the making of the holy man, or the rise and function of the holy man, and later changed also certain after you have also traveled more extensively or learned languages.
Oh, yes, I think that's so. I myself would have been less interested in what Constantine had for breakfast than in what he thought at breakfast.
Maybe I forgot. Maybe I got this anecdote wrong. So maybe you asked what he thought at breakfast. Okay.
What he had for breakfast is well covered by the material culture school of historians. They will doubtless find even the remnants of his breakfast in some camp rubbish heap which they have conscientiously excavated. But what I think is important maybe is to understand someone like Lawrence McKay and the environment which enabled him to thrive, but particularly at this time, is how to put it, the romantic Toryism That is romantic. I don't mean right-wing in a strict political sense, but the romantic Toryism that always deliberately nurtures a sense in post-war Britain. This is very much post-war Britain, Britain of the 1950s, in a post-war Britain of a sort of nostalgia, a real poignant wish that certain things had not happened, and a real determination that certain options, which are now closed down, would be treated as somehow valid options, not merely failures. And I think it's that, what I would call romantic Toryism, that's a rather, but it's one which in fact drew its roots out of the very best of the historicizing movement connected with the Romantic movement. In some ways, it goes straight back to ultimately Herder and Lawrence Lecane's colleague, equally gifted, equally eccentric, Frank McEachran, wrote one of the few good books in English on Herder.
Oh, okay.
So it has a very respectable genealogy. It is not only historical novels, Walter Scott, the whole great English regret for the Industrial Revolution, but also firm roots, wherever it can be traced, in the mounting historicismus of 19th century Europe, which somehow survived in a remarkably vigorous forms among history teachers in major English schools. We were romantics, and rather proud of it. In a Britain, which was after all one of the most progressive and most unromantic countries in Europe at that time.
Then maybe I'd like to connect with both the ambience of the post-war Britain, but also something that we've mentioned about learning languages as a need when one travels, but also about something that you mentioned, and that is when learning Hebrew with Roberta Chestnut at Oxford, that she had an approach which introduced you to the culture through learning the language. Now, to go back to post-war Britain, you mentioned, or rather, post-war Ireland in Dublin when you were learning German with Ernest Shire, and then you say a beautiful sentence that he taught you to think German by reading Stefan Zweig. What came to my mind is that with this chronological closeness with Zweig, one can easily reimagine the world of yesterday, but can one then learn to think Greek or to think Syriac by reading late antique sources, for example?
Oh, yes, I really do. And that's why I've always remained, this is one of the reasons why I've always remained a historian rather than a philologian. No matter how much I enjoyed learning languages, from Ernst Shire in German, from Roberta Chestnut for Hebrew, no matter how much that process was highly meaningful and challenging for me, I always treated the language as a door, simply a door that is locked, which one has to take off the lock, just enough to at least sense the sheer alienness of other means of expression. When one, for instance, reads of Syriac word epithets for Christ as Savataba, as the good doctor, you are not just learning the Syriac for doctor and the Syriac for good. You are also learning a whole way of seeing a figure very well known to us from our Protestant or Catholic background in just a slightly different angle. And it's rather like meeting a relative that one had not known, and that thrill of recognizing in that relative a kinship and difference. So above all, to learn a language is an earnest that you wish to step over a certain bridge, to overcome a certain difficulty, because you actually need a bridge. There is no easy way. And I think the danger of the spread of international learned languages, like, say, international English, or of translation machines, is that they undermine that awareness of the sheer thrill of crossing the gap. So I would advise students to learn as many languages as they can, but not necessarily to commit themselves to a total philological immersion. I mean, G.K. Chesterton, the humorist, said, anything is worth doing, even if you do it badly.
But it's very tempting, as you said. I mean, if you start, I remember when I was reading Syriac with Manolis Papoutskakis in Princeton, and, you know, he has the love for Syriac and also Armenian. And I remember, I mean, how this is to read the texts for the texts. For me, it was too late also. I mean, I was already a historian by then, but I see this can be very tempting. Now, and we actually, in our program, we very much look into languages, that there are at least a few of them already, because this is the basic. They can learn still another language also too, but there need to be already some basic languages, otherwise you can't do serious historical research, at least not in the pre-modern field. I don't know how is it in modern fields, but in pre-modern fields, we look very much into this. But I mean, from the book, there was one thing, you know, I found surprising. I mean, with the languages, I knew from you very much, and I knew how well you know also the languages. I also remember you know some Turkish from Kutlu. I remember this, and you really enjoyed also learning languages. What I was surprised how much traveling also meant for you. I mean, I'm not surprised in general that the historian should travel and see the landscapes, but the story you wrote about, you could not write a book about Sasanian Iran because of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. This had surprised me. I mean, first of all, I did not know that you had thought this, that you had in mind, but you were very adamant that this is not possible because you could not return there, although you had seen the country. I mean, you had traveled this up to Afghanistan. But can you tell us a little bit about this? I mean, this was really something where you thought this is, you would, I mean, in order to write a book, I think you said in the Brodel style, that would be something where you constantly, I mean, or maybe even writing the book, being in Iran. Is this correct?
Oh, yes, I think it is. But there is a background to this. First of all, I began traveling relatively late in my life compared with the average graduate student. I know you, Volker, and many other my students in Princeton, they would return and tell me they had been to Kurdistan, they'd been to Yemen, they'd been all over the place. I envied them greatly and was amazed at their speed. But I began with a very slow Europe, where one did not travel regularly, where France was by far the most immediate neighbor, and therefore, quite frankly, quite apart from its own enormously high standards, French scholarship was the second only to English. And so we're dealing partly with the story of the widening of Europe in the 1970s. And I was certainly taking full advantage of that widening. One of the reasons was, of course, a single great French book, which is Fernand Braudel, The Mediterranean and Mediterranean Society in then the Mediterranean world in the age of Philip II. Now, this is not Philip the Macedonian. It is Felipe, El Rey Felipe, devoted to warfare and diplomacy and trade in the Mediterranean in the 16th century. It was a masterpiece at simply evoking the landscapes against which history happened. Bourdelle himself developed a very sophisticated view of the workings of history with the different rhythms and related to the rhythms of the climate and the landscape. I don't think, were as consequential as he was, but we simply read it for its genius to conjure up what was the landscape behind these events.
We still read this actually today. We have a historiography of the Mediterranean world at our CEU, and we always give them parts of Bourdelle, also because it's beautifully written. I mean, you like to read this.
Yeah, it really is lovely, and this is an argument also for translation. I remember reading Bourdelle actually when I was an undergraduate in Oxford in 1955, it must have been. But then Sean Reynolds' wonderful English translation, the equivalent of Scott Moncrief's translation of Proust, made it available. And it was like an intravenous drip that went right through the medieval and early medieval and ancient worlds to just show it could be done. And I traveled to Iran almost within only 2 years of the publication of that book in its English version. So I already had a sort of, how to put it, at least a sort of theory of landscape. And I wanted to see how the Sasanian Empire. So certainly on both occasions, I devoted as much time as possible to actually traveling, to covering the distances, to realizing the sheer size of the Sasanian Empire.
And you had already thought about a certain time frame, then also like Bourdelle had Philip II that you were thinking, it's a combination, right? I mean, it's several volumes, where you get really the landscape and then where you have the historical situation. Yeah.
With the Histoire événementielle as a function of these slower rhythms. Mm-hmm. And those were certainly one of my happiest moments of taking on new things.
In which time frame had you thought about Sasanian? I mean, where you wanted to situate this at the later stages, or 3rd century or 6th century? Where had you already thought about this? Where to situate? And if we speak about the Mediterranean, this has of course developed also in Mediterranean scholarship to Abulafia and Nicholas Purcell and others have now written about the comparison would be the Iranian plateau or Mesopotamia. Had you already thought about how to situate the landscape there with the history? There is also a long history in Mesopotamia, and then also with the Achaemenids, with earlier dynasty, about the Persian history, where to situate then the history within this landscape?
Oh yes, I at that time was very much, when I say I and the books that were available to me. And one must always remember, when you meet a historian, he or she is framed with publications. Mm. And you have to read the dates of the publications very carefully so as to realize what things were not available.
Yes.
And there was a lot at that time that was not available. What was available, I think, was first of all a sense of the continuous political culture of the Sasanian Empire. This had been actually reinforced in Persianist quarters by Mary, the work of Mary Boyce, for instance, who went out of her way to show that the so-called letter of Tanzar, the letter of advice of the wise man to the ideal Persian king, was indeed a product of the 3rd century and not a sort of a confection, a historical novel almost of the 5th and 6th century. So it was this firm reminder, just in one book, which was published, I think, in about 1970, that one should treat Sasanian culture as, in fact, a continuum with different articulations as the centuries passed on. So it was that which influenced me. I wanted to find what were the most enduring social and ideological structures that enabled this empire to function. I think nowadays I would not have been quite as confident. There's a lot to be said for ignorance and few books, because it does give you confidence. There are no things that bar the way. And
absolutely, yes. That is very true, yes.
The World of Late Antiquity, which is published, I think, 1972, was an extraordinarily confident book. And like most confidence books, people can pull it apart in many aspects, but perhaps the confidence and the enthusiasm will not be pulled apart.
Maybe we can also connect to this, talk about the landscape, because obviously it is very important for a historian to see the places and the landscapes and the nature of which he is writing. Now I'd like to turn this on a very personal note. When I was in high school, I was very much divided whether I want to study art history or classics, and the book that helped me decide was your book, The World of Late Antiquity, because I was reading it at the end of high school and I was deeply influenced by the number of illustrations. And then I told people, but illustrations are as important as language, as the text. Some people told me that I'm speaking nonsense, but I wanted to believe that the amount of illustration that you put in the book had a reason. And then when reading your memoirs, I did find that reason. You speak how you became a medievalist by looking at the medieval architecture of Oxford, even though it's not, it's a later interpretation. On that note, I'd like to ask you something rather personal from my case. First of all, why did you put so many illustrations in the book? And secondly, how can art and visual culture and everything that the person of the past has seen help us reimagine and help us understand the past beyond the language, beyond the textual sources?
Yes. As far as the World of Late Antiquity goes, it was unabashedly, shamelessly an art book. I chose Thames and Hudson precisely because they were art publishers. Now, to be an art publisher was in some ways in the England of the 1970s to offer a rather lightweight approach. One would speak of these well-illustrated books as coffee table books. I think Plauderbuch may be the word. Sort of not really serious history, just sort of pretty pictures. Now, I went for that precisely because I wanted to tell a story from beginning to end of the mutation of the classical tradition as seen from the visual point of view. That is, I really wanted people to open the book to see, to begin with, the proud hyperclassicism of the Leptis Magna Forum at the beginning, and to end with this sort of shimmering mosaics of the Umayyad Mosque at Damascus as part of a single story. And of course, who do you blame for that? You blame Vienna. This was very much the Viennese sound. It was very much from, and you know, you're close enough to graduate students to know what it's like to have a major controversy constantly in mind. And one of my private controversies, and there were not many of them, many I could share in Oxford, but that was the Orient Eau de Rome, the whole issue of how much does Roman architecture and Roman art and Roman religious forms come from outside the empire as an Eastern exotic. So I mingled with pretty crazy people, I might say, with Josef Strigowski, with the whole debates on the weight of the Oriental religions, of the Oriental art, of Orientalizing, the history of the dome, the enormous importance to someone like Strigowski as the emergence of the dome as a distinctive Eastern import into the seemingly closed classical Greco-Roman world. So I think that would be my reason. Also because, and this means that the choice of illustrations were never entirely random. They were always dominated by the material produced by this controversy. And the other controversy was, of course, which was more recent, dating from the 1950s, very much connected with that sort of giant of ancient scholarship, Sanca Mazzarino, his very challenging notion of la democrazione della cultura, the democratization of culture, as a major feature of the later Roman Empire. Now, he gave that, if I remember rightly, she announced that hypothesis at the International Stockholm Historical Congress with a large Soviet delegation present. That, he said, was the true revolution. Not the revolution of the end of the slave society and the rise of feudalism, but the more subtle but equally decisive revolution of the spreading of Greco-Roman culture into forms and into groups which had previously been held strictly at arm's length. And there I was very fortunate to have illustrated books, also published by Thames and Hudson, some of the great protagonists of that debate. Above all, the Italian Marxist Bianco Bandinelli. I think without that Art of Rome, which came out almost at the same time as my World of Late Antiquity, which, if I remember rightly, I must have read in a very early volume, in a very early form, that the Art of Rome and the provinces, capturing that dialogue between the central and the peripheral in the evolution of Roman art and architecture, that gave me, in fact, God's plenty. I remember I took only about a week to put all of these together, partly because they had been already grouped.
There is, again, to continue with landscapes and to connect with the landscapes, I remember very vividly, and I said I want to mention this name, a talk with late Slobodan Deni Ćurčić. And he told me that basically everyone coming from an Orthodox country who's anyhow introduced to the principles of history and of architecture would always be a good historian of Byzantine architecture because they grew up in an environment where they use the same spaces, the same liturgical spaces, the same religious spaces. People coming from Serbia quite often the same medieval churches that they are studying. You likewise mention how this visuality of Hellenistic Protestantism and the medieval architecture of England and Ireland influenced you as well. So would you say that it's not only the landscape of what we study, but also the landscape in which we grew up in that influences our future careers?
Oh, I think you're entirely right about that. And let me illustrate how it might work. Within a few miles of our house near Dublin Bay, basically Glenageary, an ordinary suburb of 15 miles from Dublin, one would be reminded of the tremendous because don't forget, when you're dealing with a religiously mixed country, you're dealing with two groups, both of which actually claim to be universal. The universal Protestantism and the universal Catholicism. Hence, of course, many issues of the conflict. And it was very obvious that the most humble Catholic chapel, we would always call it a chapel, somehow to slightly demote it, the most humble Catholic chapel usually had a Roman basilica design that looked straight from Ireland about 1900 to Rome, and the pride of the Irish Catholics in being ultra-Roman, ultramontane, while every single Protestant church in Ireland, that is of the Church of Ireland, the established Church of Ireland, was of course perfect Gothic. So you could almost tell immediately which church belonged to which international artistic community. The borders were blurred, of course. Catholics also claimed the Middle Ages with very great force. Their major cathedrals were often also Gothic, but nonetheless, certainly in Protestant circles, there was a sense of the Gothic as simply being the appropriate architecture of a specific group with specific horizons.
What also came to my mind is the question of course, if our contemporary landscapes influence us, what about the memorial landscapes or the collective memories? For example, speaking about Nicolas Delange, nowadays Rabbi Nicolas Delange, you say that he's a true Sephardi, nostalgic of the Spanish background in which Judaism has once flourished. Nicolas will go on riding holidays in Andalusia, and I will exchange postcards with him in Hebrew, and so on and so forth. Obviously, he's a scholar much influenced by his Sephardic background and by the landscapes of Andalusia, of Spain, maybe even of Israel. Would you say that these collective memories or ideas of our ancestry can also influence our approach to historical scholarship?
I think it does, as long as it's not over, as long as it doesn't overbalance one's judgment. And here, after all, we're talking about the emotional forces which keep us going as scholars. They're the ones which enable us to choose what we think is an agenda that is worthwhile pursuing. They're basically, to use Augustinian terms, they're basically things that influence the will and the notion of what gives force to the will. It's not a purely in the head matter. So within limits. A little bit of Sehnsucht does nobody any harm. It really gives people, as it did Nicholas, a sense of loyalty to themes such as the interaction of Jewish and Christian in the early centuries of the early church, an understanding of what, say, Origen meant when he was attempting to spiritualize the Hebrew scriptures, when he was attempting to enter into dialogue with rabbis in Caesarea. I think that Nicholas used his Sehnsucht very creatively, and not only on holiday. And once again, of course, part of the challenge again of the visual and the landscape is if you are in Andalusia, you are suddenly brought up against descending from the very Gothic and Renaissance north of Spain. You suddenly find yourself in some of the most exquisite examples of Islamic art, the Alhambra of Granada, that have their parallels right across from the Taj Mahal back to Spain.
Speaking about the emotional force that leads us, but also as you said, a few warnings that could lead us beyond what we are supposed to do as historians. When you speak about your sabbatical year, then you mention meeting a gentleman at the National Gallery of Ireland and speaking about arts with him. And then at the very end of the chapter, you warn us, I quote, "Not all of literature and art can be dragooned to serve a historian's agenda. People need to breathe paintings as well as to use them as documents." But what I wonder as a young art historian is, can a person both breathe a painting and use it as a document? And can a historian or any scholar of the past enjoy his sources as a work of art as much as a document of the past that he is studying?
I think this is a major, and it's an unresolved tension in some ways, and it runs through the historiography from one end to the other. My feel has always been that one often begins with art as a document because of one's historical training. But then one really has to ask, what does it mean to see this art in a given circumstances, with your mind filled with some ideas, which again the historian has to go out of his way with very great care to avoid false familiarity, to ask us what was really in the eyes and in the head of people who saw that art for the first time. I think I think if you don't have a sense of, I think to call it beauty may be the right thing, but the sense of something which grabs you, often in a subverbal manner, you don't quite get it. I actually wrote about that when I was visiting the mosaics of Ravenna. They're not for the first time, but I had visited them. I'd done my homework. I had read all the right books. I knew what the iconography was. I could work out all the poses of the court of Justinian in the mosaic of San Vitale, but I simply hadn't realized how haunting those very bright iridescent greens were. And that juxtaposition of bright red and green gave me, I think, another dimension. It made me say, oh yes, this is also what held the hearts of the people who went there.
Being also the voice of, let's say, the youngest generation of scholars in this talk, On these questions of methodology and approach, I also wanted to ask you something. You speak in detail how you were deeply influenced by anthropology, from the part in which you speak about your childhood and living between Ireland and Sudan. You, of course, mention Evans Pritchard. Then afterwards, how anthropology deeply influenced your works on science and sexuality. It reminded me of when I came to see you. I came from a very disciplinary training at art history. We are a very different bunch of people. You have historians of church, historians of literature, classical philologists, art historians, archaeologists. I don't think that there are two people with same training in here, nor dealing with same stuff. But it was very odd to me that all of us have a connecting tissue, and this connection is actually anthropology. We all use some anthropological theories. Somehow this is what connects us. A very old professor of mine from Belgrade said in 1960s or 70s, when he heard the Russian word naddisciplinarnost, so over-disciplinarity, then he said there's no such thing as interdisciplinarity or over-disciplinarity or multidisciplinarity, but rather there is only, as he said, the anthropologization of disciplinarity. So would you say that, how important is anthropology for humanities, and would you say that this is what connects all of us?
Yes, that is a wonderful question. It's a very big one. And certainly I can answer it as it were autobiographically, rather than answer it in the abstract. I think what anthropology certainly gave us at this particular time was access to societies different from our own, in a manner that seemed to parallel, no more than that, that seemed to parallel that with which medieval and ancient societies also both resembled and differed. So my first advocacy for anthropology, and this is very much, again, the England of the 1950s and 60s and 70s that we're talking about. We're talking about an England where there were only very few established anthropology departments. And these were basically research institutes where the whole rise of what in America one would call anthro, just a simple anthro, as if it was an answer to almost everything. But this was earlier, and what it gave was basically a time machine. It what enabled us to, as it were, think we could go back through the centuries, being warned and armed by modern experience of analogous societies. And this would encourage us to look out for different sides, for different points, to look above all for where the motors of change are, all of those things which are often hidden in the historical sources, because most of the historical sources are written by contemporaries so involved in their own world that they do not give any thought to those wider issues. So in a sense, the anthropologists helped the historians to understand the unthought thoughts of very different societies from the ones we ourselves come from. And it also does one thing, which is, of course, the greatest importance. It avoids false familiarity. We call it anachronism. We call it an anachronism. It's a heavy word, hard to pronounce even. We call it anachronism, and that is the one sin of the historian. He must never allow the present to invade the past. And I think anthropology was one of our ways of ensuring that that was so.
Maybe I can jump in there with, one thing where, I often think the presence or the question of anachronistic interpretations always comes up because, I mean, we are set in certain settings. We grow up with certain values, understandings, and we believe we understand both other countries, other societies, as well as, the past. And I think one of the things you described very nicely is you coming from Ireland with, Protestant and Catholics, as you just said again, coming to Britain, where there were less religious sensibilities or sensitivity for this. And quite frankly, I have to say also when I, became interested in religious history, I was often taught that it comes back to social questions, which, certain groups often you can tie also, to, but religion in itself, is a force, but this is not necessarily something this is always being understood. My question would be, where would you see that, the scholarship of late antiquity goes to? I mean, when you started, it has been very different. There was no field of late antiquity. There were patristics, for example. So you did have religious, not just religious scholars, but, religious clerics, affiliated with the church, both Protestant as well as Catholics, which also matters in the understanding of the papacy, for example, in late antiquity. Today, this looks very different. We still have patristics, we also have clerics, but the field has changed. Do you see this also, questions both? We're still, if you look at Europe, people leave the church, secularism is still on the rise. At the same time, you see Christian churches rising in other parts of the world. Islam is also rising. We now also study Islam as part of late antiquity. Do you see this would also influence the fields and how we approach late antiquity, this kind of demographic change that has certainly come about?
This is something which I very much hope will happen, because I think that one of the most interesting developments that I have lived through is the growing tolerance of religion. I'd like to write a book one of these days called The Tolerance of Religion in the 20th Century. That is the gradual emergence, certainly in historical studies, of interpretative frameworks that are no longer taken from secular models, that no longer assume a secular teleology, but that actually do reflect as best they can, with all the difficulties involved, the feelings, the desires, the sense of loyalties of religious persons. I think the rise of Islam, no matter how much one may regret certain aspects of it, are nonetheless a serious wake-up call that there are a lot of people who take religion seriously, and they themselves have to be taken seriously. And I think that there, the desecularization of history has done nothing but good. And this one can say from the ancient world upwards to the most modern study of modern religious movements, which, as you say, Volker, occur in ways we don't often predict. I think it was the inability, almost as the sheer inability of historians, even those who knew Iran very well, to predict the sheer extent and violence of the Iranian Revolution. These are not necessarily happy things, but they are things which should not take us unaware. And there, I think, one of the things which in some ways led me to end my book in 1988 was the feeling that, yes, Berlin Wall has almost gone down and will soon. And then a totally new set of problems. And many of these problems are linked to, in fact, the rise of Islam as an intellectual force, as well as a political force, which we as historians of late antiquity, with the skills needed to understand this world, are under an obligation. So what has surprised me is always the way in which things which I gave very little attention to in the 1960s have not only achieved a greater dimension and weight, but it's possible to talk about them. A language and a language of scholarship that can embrace them is being created, and that's one of the most exciting aspects of our time.
Can I ask there a last question which is connected to this? And I was also fascinated to read. I mean, you were at many institutions. You end the autobiography while being then settled at Princeton. And you also tell us a little bit about the institutions you moved to and from. And there seemed to be a little bit of love-hate relationship also with Oxford. Gave you a lot when you came there, but at the same time also, I mean, it seems to be, a lot of tasks on teaching undergraduate there, and it looks a little bit like not as professional as you call it, like the American schools already at this time. This has changed, of course, a great deal. Although I remember when I was in Oxford for a year, I think I complained because they put me in modern history, and I said I do late antiquity until I learned that everything after Diocletian is modern history. So my question is, what do you think would be, the ideal setting for educating historians, teaching historians? I mean, there's a lot of changes also in Ivy League universities going around. I mean, in the US at the moment, of course, very political debates also. If I remember now, 2 Ivy League presidents stepping down over political reasons. What do you think would be a good ideal institution where you could teach historians, and how would this look like?
Well, the one thing that it would look like, I sincerely hope, would be not an institution in such a hurry. It's the speed of these changes which make them very suspect. It's the sheer rapidity with which a buzzword, a slogan can take over, apparently like viruses in an air conditioning system, the upper levels of major universities. So what I would hope for, first and foremost, is not to be among people with such a ex officio hurry, because they're usually out of date very quickly. And we usually find, to our shame, that large aspects of scholarship have been neglected as a result. I'd have thought that one of the needs of a university is to recognize that a university education is not a whole culture. It's in giving relatively young persons the skills with which to handle a life which we all hope will go on for 60, 70 more years. And I think the danger of universities becoming the sole media of culture is a very dangerous one. There in my ambivalences about Oxford and Ireland in many ways, my ambivalence about Oxford never really affected that sense that at least Oxford was making the claim, even if it was highly class-based in so many ways, despite that rigidity of the English class system, you at least had learned bodies which said you're being trained for something wide.
Mm.
You're not simply being trained to be professors.
Mm.
And I think that was always the danger, always the tension between American professionalism and, in some ways, if you
Max Weber already talked about this, right? I mean, between the German system and the American system, but this was 1919 or so, 1920.
Those were very wise words. Most certainly, when one is age 30 to 40, one feels very strongly the limitations of one's own academic environment. And where you sense the limitations, there are the places where one should devote one's thought to. And I think in England it was the gentlemanly amateurism, which gave a lot of opportunities, but also enabled the growth of a very inward-looking culture. The Americans were almost the other way round. They had to be told to go slow.
We from CEU, we have many changes at the moment also going on. Our Department of Medieval Studies is about being merged with history. So from next fall onwards, we will be the Department of Historical Studies, will be one big department at CEU. And of course, we are also inventing new studies regularly and accreditations. So this is something which takes a lot of time and, which we believe will make our university ready, for having interesting degrees and attracting students. But it is a lot of work. And, the question is always, what would be the best way in having, historians or art historians or archaeologists we also have in our department, and how to educate them. And of course, how many graduates do you have at the end? And, will they get jobs in academia or related museums or other studies they could do about this? So, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Volker.
I will, for the very end, like to maybe wrap this up, starting with a quote. At the end of subchapter, which I think has the most creative title, Are Cowboys Catholics? You say, I quote, "My sense of the power of religion in society dates from those Dublin days. Coming to England as a schoolboy and later as a student, I was surprised by the gentle oblivion to religion that seemed to be widespread at the time. In contrast to the ethos of Ireland, I remained puzzled and increasingly frustrated by finding a similar understanding of religion as a social force in many of the teachers of history in Oxford. It was against what struck me as this cozy attitude that I would direct much of my work in later years." I think that both this talk of ours, but also the memoirs themselves, prove that the entire life does indeed formulate a scholar. But would you then say that on this path of self-reflection, maybe every historian should write a memoir of their own?
Oh dear. I think that the reason to write a memoir was to historicize myself. I suddenly realized, when I was talking above all to my Princeton graduates, to Volker and to Volker's friends, that to explain aspects of the institutional life behind my published work, that is, behind my published work, not to explain my published work, but to explain what was behind it. That was like explaining the Merovingians. There was a real sense of pastness, or the past had already come to settle on Oxford, even on the American universities. even on the opening stages of the study of late antiquity. I realized, leafing through the world of late antiquity, which I often do just for the joy of the illustration still, but this was dated in many ways. That is, scholarship had got beyond. And I think that it's that sense of always having to catch up that one really wants to give every encouragement to. I think there's the issues of syllabuses, the issues of ideology, they boil down basically to what encourages people to take these long journeys into the strange country of the past. And I certainly began my autobiography with a feeling that by 1988, even my own past had become a strange country. And therefore it was time to sort of settle down, do what historians do, read documents, work out chronologies, go through old photographs.
You certainly succeeded. I mean, I have to say I read your book with immense joy. And as you said, I mean, I know your published work. I have them actually there. They're standing up here, or I was just looking at Augustin, the old Faber and Faber version I actually have, and I have also here Religion and Society, I think a more rare volume. I knew about this, but I mean, you really put some dots together behind the scenes, as you know, called it, to understand this. And, you know, with some surprising facets like the Sasanians. I mean, this, you know, is something I did not know from your published work, and I did not know that you wanted to write a book about this. But the others, I mean, you know, Mary Douglas and, you know, the 1960s, and I mean, you know, anthropology we talked about. I mean, also these developments of Foucault. Also, we have not really talked about him, but I know this, of course, from reading Sexual Renunciation. This was something that, you know, had influenced you, and I also know Avril Cameron, you know, wrote about the map after Foucault. I think great article. But, you know, have this together in one book, including, of course, also, I very much like to read about Ireland, I have to say. I mean, the early years, this is really fascinating because for me also completely, and, you know, the relationship you had with one of the prime ministers of New Zealand, I did not know this, but we have a student from New Zealand, a former student of Lisa Bailey, who is now my PhD student. And I was telling him about this. So, I mean, then, yes. This was really, I mean, a great read, but also, I mean, in terms of historiography, very much something to learn from. So thank you very much for the book. And of course, also for the interview. We are very delighted to have you here. I can show you someone, you know, joining here, but...
Oh, what a sweet text. Lovely.
I think that maybe for the very end, the words of Dame Avril Cameron will sum up the importance and the gratitude we have for this interview. She says at the end of the praise, "It is written with deep humanity and generosity, and one comes away richer, wiser, immensely grateful, and still wanting for more." I think that all of us want for a second part of the memoir, speaking about the 40 years since 1987. Professor Brown, it was an honor, and the level of gratitude that we have truly goes well beyond my rhetorical skills. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Much appreciate this. There's the English novelist E.M. Forster once had an elderly character in one of his novels say, "I do not know what I think until I hear what I say." And I'm very grateful to you to help me remember and bring out work which now lies in my past to help me with what lies in the future. Thank you very much for it.
We thank you. Thank you very much. It was lovely.